Welcome back to My Hidden Agenda. This is Dana, and in this episode, we are going to talk about gender theory and gender studies. Now, this is an incredibly esoteric and academic topic that most people don't even realize exists, and the literature that you do encounter, it's dense enough to scare most people away. Now, even for me, somebody who really likes nerding out on things like this, like I don't really dig into all of this academic stuff that deeply, and it definitely doesn't speak to my own experiences. When I started questioning a lot of the assumptions I held about gender and my own gender, I think my beliefs on the subject were pretty in line with the average heteronormative American, which is to say that, you know, I believe that boys are boys and girls are girls, and it should be pretty obvious and self-explanatory what the differences are. Now, any discussion about gender as a spectrum or gender as a performative act wasn't going to convince me in my own experiences of the world that there aren't just simply boys and girls out there, and there really isn't much more to say about it. So, when I started taking my own desires of being female more seriously, it became pretty obvious that in some nagging way, this explanation of gender just really wasn't quite good enough. And all of this talk about genders, it must be more complicated. And that's about when I found this book by Kate Bornstein called My Gender Workbook, which is right here. It's also available at San Diego Public Library or wherever else you get your reading material. And now, this book is really novel and just different than anything else I've ever read. It's probably the best intro to gender studies that I could recommend to anybody. I mean, like Kate's other writings, it's funny and playful and pretty kitschy. And she's formatted the book a lot like what I remember my middle school Spanish textbooks to be like. She breaks the text into exercises for the reader and asks for a heavy amount of reader participation to get the most out of the book. Now, I did not follow those instructions. I pretty much read the book just cover to cover. But even just doing that, this transformed the way that I think about gender. So instead of just presenting her ideas and explaining how this whole gender thing works, she asks a lot of probing questions and guides the reader through this exercise that takes them through a pretty fundamental review of what makes up the experience of gender. And she leans on the reader to fill in the gaps with their own feelings and experiences that just make it much easier to buy into all these really abstract concepts and understand how this actually makes a difference in everyday life. So here are some of the basic premises that she brings up and talks about in the book. 1. Imagine what the perfect man or woman is supposed to be. 2. Imagine how you are or aren't this perfect man or woman. 3. Where did this perfect image of a man or woman come from? 4. What are the institutions that insist on demarcating you by your gender? 5. What are other ways that you split people into groups? Some of the things that I learned as I explored these questions were that my ideas of what makes someone male or female are a lot more tenuous, arbitrary, and culturally informed than I ever realized. I mean, looking more closely at these classically gendered qualities, it became pretty clear that most people really do blend both genders into their person in a really seamless way. And then, when you start to realize how many other binary systems we have of demarcating people and breaking them into groups there are out there. I mean, just to give you some examples, there's butch and femme, top and bottom, employer, employee, white and of color. I mean, in that context, this whole male-female dynamic, it starts to feel a little bit just made up. And what we've ascribed as male and what we've ascribed as female qualities. And it just really doesn't capture the breadth and detail of the varied relationships we have with our other fellow human beings. It was also very interesting to learn in this book how much our Western worldview of genders is informed by our similar categorization of people by race and by class, and how these labels function in a really similar way in our culture. I mean, Kate Bornstein does she does like place all of this into these systems of power dynamics that they can come across a bit Marxist at times, and like the way that she kind of like frames gender is this sort of like class struggle. And like I found myself a little bit uncomfortable with how much it lingered on this at times in the books, but it's not heavy-handed, and it's actually like pretty useful and valid and helpful in really analyzing gender in a more nuanced way. So my gender workbook my gender workbook, it's definitely not the be-all end-all when it comes to gender theory. It really only brushes the surface, and in a lot of ways it asks a lot more questions than it answers. But that's really the point. I mean, in my experience, like gender has become this like Pandora's box, and like this book really felt like one little portal into like this greater mystery of what it all means. Now, this book is probably going to end up being one of the few ones that I come back to and read more than once in my life. Like I recommend it to anybody who's interested in gender, but even more so to people who aren't. So, thank you for watching. Until next time.